Hello and welcome to Pictorial Planet. My name's John Finch. I've come to a location near Hopeman in northeast Scotland on the Morayshire coast, where there's a particular cave that I like to photograph. It's this one behind me. One of the things I like about this particular shot is the rocks and the lines and the lovely nuances of the stone around the cave, the sandstones and so on. So I really like those shades, those tones. I've brought with me FP4 and my Rolleiflex SL66, and I'm going to be developing this film in FX1. Now, Crawley's FX1 was an astounding achievement. It was the sharpest developer that probably anyone has made, at least up there with the very best of them. It's an acutance developer and it gives a slight speed increase to the film. So I'm running my FP4 through at ISO 200, which I've measured through testing is an accurate speed for that film with this developer. When Crawley formulated FX1, he was formulating a sharpness first developer. He wanted to make the sharpest possible developer he could make. And he based it on a previous developer that was already being used called the Butler formula. Now, Butler had made this developer many years earlier. He'd made this developer for 35mm film, as it happens, because the Leica cameras had been launched by Lights and were very popular, and he wanted to make a developer for these Leica cameras for 35mm film. Now, what Butler did was he used a low metol amount and a high alkalinity amount. But more modern photographers in the 60s or 50s thought the Butler developer was a little too contrasty, and so already they were reducing the alkaline by a half, the sodium carbonate by a half. And that reduced some of that high contrast. But what Crawley realized was you could also reduce the metol by a half as well, which actually made the developer sharper. There was another secret sauce that Crawley was going to use, but that's how it worked out initially. And so what we've got is low developing agent, 0.5 grams of metol. We have a 5-gram amount of sodium sulfite, and we have 2.5 grams of sodium carbonate. So low developing agent, why did he go for that? Why did he reduce the developing agent by half? Well, first of all, he wanted to suppress infectious development. And what that is where a grain of halide is being developed, it could sometimes spread to the halides around it, even if they weren't really supposed to be developed. They hadn't been struck by light. So there was a very slight spreading of the development, and this was called infectious development. And sometimes it can go wild and just infect all the grains on the negative, and you get fog, you get this fog happening. So he wanted to reduce infectious development as much as possible. And by reducing the metol, that helped. The second reason he reduced the metol, though, was to enhance edge effects. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. Now, the sulfite's very interesting. 5 grams of sulfite. And this was really important for Crawley. He'd done a lot of research into these compounds, and he'd worked out that you needed less than 6 grams per litre of sodium sulfite in order to maximize the speed of the emulsion, the speed of the film. So basically this developer increases your ISO of your film by at least 2/3 of a stop. I run FP4 through at 200 ISO, 2/3 of a stop faster. And I don't do that randomly. I tested to get that speed. I know I'm getting 200 ISO out of my FP4. And it's because of this amount of sulfite. Now, interestingly, he found that if you used less than 5 grams of sulfite, you started to lose that speed advantage, and it dropped back and dropped back. In fact, by the time you reached about 2 grams of sulfite per litre, your speed was now normal for that film. So you'd lost that 2/3 of a stop increase in speed of the film. And note, this increase in speed does not affect the grain of the film. It doesn't do any harm at all, if you want to think of it that way, to your photographs or to your negatives. What it does is it's just a natural speed enhancement because of this 5 grams of sodium sulfite per litre. The sodium sulfite also has another property that Crawley was trying to combat, and that was regeneration. Now, metol, left to its own devices, will work for a short period of time developing silver halide, and then it will slow down and practically stop. And this is because there are bromides formed, byproducts formed, which stop the metol working. Well, sodium sulfite helps regenerate the metol to make it keep working. And that's a problem if you're trying to make the sharpest possible developer. Because there's a thing called the Eberhard effect. And that is where the metol stops working where it's in a high development area and continues to work in a low development area. So if you have a sharp line between a high and a low contrast area on your photograph, the metol will slow down on the high area but keep working in the low area. And because there's some spare excess metol in the low area, because it's still working, some of it seeps through to the edge of the high area and makes it work, continues to work, where it would normally have stopped. And because of the bromide byproducts in the high contrast area, some of those will seep through the emulsion to the low contrast area and slow down the metol in a fine line on the edge of the high and low contrast area. And this is the Eberhard effect. And it creates what we call Mackie lines. These are lines that form on the emulsion, microscopic lines that the eye perceives as more sharpness. So by lowering the sodium sulfite levels, he stopped the regeneration of the metol, so it would create even more Mackie lines, even higher occlutants. Sodium carbonate, we've already talked about, it's high alkali, used a lot actually in paper developers because you need much more contrast in a paper developer. And he reduced that from the butyl formula by a half, which was actually, I think, common knowledge in those days to do that to the butyl formula to reduce the contrast a little bit. But let's just talk a moment about the secret sauce, because this is what made FX1 completely different from Butyl. Butyl didn't do this, and this was to add this homeopathic amount of potassium iodide. And I mean homeopathic. I think it's 1 in 20 million parts of potassium iodide. He made a 0.001% solution of potassium iodide, and he added only 5 milliliters of this to 1 liter of working developer. So all the numbers I've given you are for a working developer, not for a stock, for a working developer. Now, we're going to talk in a moment about how to make this potassium iodide, because there's some important tips you need to know that don't seem to be covered very well by anybody else that I've seen doing this. So I want to make sure you get this proper tip. So don't tune out now. Hang on in there, because you'll need to know how to make this. But let's just put this developer together. So here I have 800 ml of water at 50 degrees centigrade. And now I'm going to just add a pinch of sulfite. Remember, we always do this with metol. We add just a pinch of sulfite and we dissolve that in, and that's because we need to get rid of any oxygen that's been dissolved in this water. So once that dissolved oxygen has been removed by this sodium sulfite pinch, we're now ready to add our metol, and it won't oxidize when we put it in. So now we gently add the metol, dissolve that. Metol will not dissolve in a high sulfite solution, so this is why we add just a pinch of sulfite, and then the metol, and then the rest of the sulfite. So now you can see that's completely dissolved, and now we add our sulfite, and make sure that's fully dissolved before we add the next chemical. That's standard procedure. Just move this stirrer around to get those edges. You'll notice I don't have the stirrer going really fast, and that's because I don't want to introduce any oxygen into this water. So I just have it going moderate speed so I don't get that vortex coming down. If you use one of these, keep away from that vortex. It doesn't help at all. So there we are, that's all of the sulfite dissolved, and now we need to add our sodium carbonate. 2.5 grams. This is a working solution, so this will be ready to develop a film right away. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but another reason that Crawley didn't want to reduce the sulfite too much, of course, was keeping properties. If you reduce your sulfite down below 2 or 3 grams per litre, the properties of the developers keep is very poor. It'll only keep a few hours, certainly not more than a few days in a sealed bottle. So there we have that all dissolved now, and then Crawley's secret sauce, and this was his potassium iodide. And for this I use a syringe, and we add just 5 milliliters to 1 litre of working solution. Now, if you don't want to make a litre of working solution, of course you can change the amounts to make less, but it gets more and more difficult to measure those very small amounts. So you might have to make a litre of working solution. And you know what? I have written the more concentrated variant of this into my Patreon page, so you can get it from there. So now make sure this is fully dissolved, and then we'll move on. But first of all, I just want to show you how to make this, because there's an important thing you need to know. We've talked about sodium sulfite and the effect it has on development, but what about potassium iodide? Why did Crawley add such a microscopic amount of potassium iodide to the FX1 developer? And from what he wrote, he understood that potassium iodide was a restrainer, but used in microscopic amounts, it would help with the Eberhard effect. It would help to increase acutance of the FX1 developer. It would specifically act mostly on those lines, those contrast boundaries between light and dark areas, and sharpen them up. Now, whether it used some kind of restraining of the silver halide crystals to stop them developing, or whether it somehow helped the metol in some way to develop a little bit more in one area than another, I don't know. But he was insistent that this was important, and this is what made the difference, the biggest difference, between FX1 and the Butler formula. But I'm digressing. We need to know how to make this first. So let's go over to the sink and I'll show you. Here I have 1 gram of potassium iodide. 1 gram, and I'm going to dissolve that into 1 litre of water. Now this is an important thing that you need to know. When you dissolve this into this litre of water, you want to be stirring it for 2 minutes, and then you want to let it sit for 3 more minutes before the next stage. So I'm going to keep stirring this. It already appears to have dissolved, but you know, it's not equally distributed throughout this water. So I'll continue stirring it for 2 minutes, and then I'll let it stand for 3 minutes. It's been sat now for 3 minutes, and what's happened is, for the first 2 minutes of my stirring, I tried to completely and evenly mix that 1 gram of potassium iodide into the liquid, but it wasn't completely even. So by letting it sit for 3 minutes, it's now completely evened itself out in that solution. So now I'm going to take 100 milliliters of this 0.1% solution. So we'll take that 100 ml there, and I'm going to discard the rest of it. Now I add my 0.1% solution into there, and I make it up again to a litre. There, and again I will stir for 2 minutes, and I will let it sit for 3 minutes. Now this is very important now, because as it becomes weaker and weaker solution, it's very important for me to make sure that I've completely and evenly dissolved that potassium iodide into this water. Otherwise, as I continue, I'm not getting my proper concentration. So I'll continue to stir for 2 minutes, and then I'll let it sit for another 3. There it is, it's sat for another 3 minutes. So now I have a concentration of 0.01 grams. I need to reduce it once more. So I'm going to take my 100 mils, that's a little bit more there, 100 mils out, discard this, put my 0.01 solution in, and top it up again. Again, I'm going to stir this for 2 minutes and let it stand for 3 minutes. It's been standing for 3 minutes now, so now that 0.001 solution is fully mixed into all of that water. Now I can decant this into a bottle, and I have my correct concentration of potassium iodide that I used in the working solution. The thing with FX1 is it's a very, very sharp developer, and so any sloppiness in your photography is going to show up. So you have to try every trick you know to keep your photographs as sharp as possible. You've got to use things like coated lenses, you've got to use higher shutter speeds, you've got to use tripods. Today I'm using all those things, as well as a shutter release, and I'll be using mirror up on the camera to stop any vibration that I can from affecting the sharpness of these images. I like that. There's something exciting about it, and there's also something relaxing about going through in your mind, setting the camera up to take the sharpest possible picture that you can. So let me get on with it. I'll just show you something I brought along to help me get the camera level on this uneven surface. In a situation like this, where I am putting the tripod on a pebbly beach, it's a very uneven surface and it's very difficult to get the camera level. And so I brought with me this spirit level, which can attach to the flash mounting on the camera. These are really useful things to have with you, because I can instantly get this camera level on any surface. So that's really, really useful for me. I've set my ISO of 200 on my meter, and I'm going to take an incident meter reading. So I've made sure I've got that set on the camera, and I will take the meter reading like so. facing backwards from the camera position. And I've got a 60th at 11.5. So I'm going to set that up straight away. 11.5, whoopsie, and a 60th. There we are. So with my camera level and my cable release fitted to the camera, I'll now take the shot. I focused about 2/3 into the frame so that I should get everything in focus. So the mirror is up. I don't want to touch anything except the cable release. There. I lift the mirror up again. This time I'm going to use a 30th at 16.5. The mirror is up. And there's the shot. That should be sharp as a pin.